Commander Jake Morrison had seen many strange things during his 15 years in space, but nothing prepared him for what lay beneath the frozen surface of Titan. The drilling team had been working for 6 months, cutting through layers of ice and rock that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years. Dr. Laura Bennett called him to the excavation site at 3 in the morning, her voice shaking with excitement over the radio. When Jake arrived at the bottom of the shaft, he understood why she could barely contain herself. The chamber was enormous, easily the size of a football stadium, and it glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the center stood a massive structure that looked like a combination of metal and crystal, towering 30 meters high, and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Laura was already running every scanner they had over the surface, her fingers flying across her tablet as data poured in faster than she could process it. Jake approached the structure carefully, his boots crunching on the ancient stone floor. The object responded to his presence, the blue light intensifying as he got closer. Holographic displays suddenly erupted into existence all around them, filling the air with images and text in a language that looked almost familiar, but completely alien at the same time. Laura gasped and started recording everything, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. Captain Eric Hayes was having breakfast on the exploration vessel Horizon when the first transmission came through. He nearly choked on his coffee when he saw what Jake and Laura had discovered. The artifact was old, impossibly old, dating back at least 50,000 years according to the preliminary scans. But that was not the most shocking part. The holographic displays were showing ship designs, weapon systems, and technology that made everything humanity had built look like stone tools by comparison. Eric immediately ordered a complete communication blackout. Nothing about this discovery could reach the Galactic Council until they understood what they had found. For 200 years, humanity had been the newcomers in a galaxy, dominated by ancient empires. The Council controlled everything that mattered, from the jump gates that connected star systems to the trade routes that kept economies running. Humans paid tribute, followed rules, and stayed in their designated corner of space like good little children. Laura worked without sleep for 3 days straight, slowly piecing together the meaning of the symbols. The artifact was not just a piece of ancient technology. It was a message, a gift, and a warning all rolled into one. The civilization that built it had faced the same choice humanity now faced. They could accept their place as subjects of more powerful species, or they could take the knowledge offered and forge their own path. That ancient civilization had chosen submission and eventually faded into nothing. But before they disappeared, they left this artifact behind for whoever would make a different choice. The blueprints contained in the artifact were revolutionary. Jake spent hours studying the ship designs with the Horizon's engineering team. These were not the sleek, elegant vessels favored by the Council races. They were brutal, practical warships designed around principles that human engineers could understand and improve upon. The weapons did not rely on energy shields or plasma technology. They used simple physics taken to terrifying extremes, accelerating solid projectiles to speeds that would turn them into unstoppable weapons. Dr. Laura Bennett finally decoded the central message after 90 hours of continuous work. Her hands were shaking as she called Jake and Eric to her lab. The artifact had been specifically calibrated to activate only for species matching certain genetic and cultural markers. It had been waiting for humanity, or something very much like humanity, to find it. The ancient builders had seen patterns in galactic history, cycles of domination and submission that repeated across millions of years. They left these artifacts scattered across the galaxy, each one a test and a tool for breaking those cycles. Eric made the decision to send everything back to Earth through encrypted channels. Admiral Victor Kane received the data at military headquarters on Mars and immediately understood the implications. This was not just about new technology. This was about changing the fundamental balance of power in the galaxy. For the first time since humanity reached the stars, they had something the Council did not have and could not take away. The construction began in secret at shipyards throughout the solar system. The artifact's instructions were clear and detailed, allowing human engineers to build vessels far beyond their previous capabilities. The first ship started taking shape in orbit around Mars, its angular hull and heavy armor plating marking it as something completely different from anything humanity had built before. They named it the Thunderbolt, and it would be the first of many. Jake returned to Earth after spending 3 months studying the artifact on Titan. He reported directly to Admiral Kane, bringing with him complete copies of everything they had learned. The artifact continued to reveal new information as they studied it, layer upon layer of knowledge that suggested the ancient builders had been far more advanced than anyone in the current galactic civilization. The technology they offered was intentionally limited, calibrated to be just powerful enough to level the playing field without giving humanity weapons they could not control. Lieutenant Danny Foster was assigned to the Thunderbolt as weapons officer. He spent weeks training on systems that did not exist in any manual or textbook. The main cannons could accelerate tungsten rods to relativistic speeds, turning simple metal into planet-killing projectiles. The missile systems used AI guidance far more sophisticated than anything the Council had ever developed. And the ship's armor could withstand direct hits from weapons that would vaporize conventional vessels. Dr. Sophie Miller led the team studying the artifact's propulsion technology. What they discovered changed everything. The Stormbreaker drives, as they came to be called, could create temporary wormholes without needing fixed gates or massive infrastructure. Humanity would no longer be dependent on Council-controlled jump gates. They could go anywhere they wanted, whenever they wanted, without asking permission from anyone. The Galactic Council learned about the discovery 6 months after the excavation. Ambassador Zethron of the Kavari Empire arrived at Earth with a fleet of warships and a list of demands. Humanity would surrender the artifact, dismantle any new technology they had developed, and submit to a complete inspection of all military facilities. Refusal would result in immediate economic sanctions and possible military action to enforce compliance. President Helen Carter met with the ambassador in the United Nations building in Geneva. She listened politely to his demands, nodded thoughtfully, and then delivered her response. Humanity would not surrender the artifact. They would not dismantle their new fleet. And they would no longer accept the Council's authority over human affairs. The age of asking permission was over. Admiral Victor Kane watched from the observation deck as the Thunderbolt completed its final systems check. 8 months of round-the-clock construction had produced something that looked more like a flying fortress than a traditional spacecraft. The ship stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its dark gray hull covered in overlapping armor plates that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Every surface bristled with weapons, sensors, and communication arrays that gave it an aggressive, predatory appearance. Lieutenant Danny Foster sat at the weapons console, running diagnostic tests on systems that still felt like science fiction to him. The main railguns drew power directly from the ship's reactor, magnetic coils accelerating projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed. He fired a test round at a target drone positioned 10,000 kilometers away. The tungsten rod crossed the distance in less than a second and simply erased the drone from existence, the kinetic energy releasing in a flash of light visible from Mars. The engineering deck hummed with activity as Dr. Sophie Miller monitored the Stormbreaker drive's first activation sequence. Unlike the jump gates that required precise calculations and fixed endpoints, this system could create a stable wormhole to any point within 1,000 light-years. The power requirements were enormous, but the artifact's designs included reactor technology that made it possible. Sophie held her breath as the drive spun up, watching as space itself began to twist and fold in front of the ship. Commander Lisa Green had been assigned as the Thunderbolt's captain, a promotion that came with both honor and immense responsibility. She stood on the bridge, surrounded by holographic displays showing every system aboard the ship. Her crew consisted of 200 men and women, all trained on equipment that had not existed a year ago. They were ready, or at least as ready as anyone could be when preparing to challenge an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. Admiral Kane addressed the crew via video link from Mars Command. He spoke plainly, without the usual military formality. They were about to change history, he told them. The Council had kept humanity small and weak for 2 centuries, controlling their expansion and limiting their growth. The Thunderbolt and her sister ships would end that era, but there would be a price. The Council would not give up power easily, and blood would be shed before this was over. 5 more Stormbreaker-class vessels completed construction over the next 3 weeks. The fleet gathered near Luna, conducting combat drills and testing their coordination systems. Each ship was a masterpiece of human engineering enhanced by ancient knowledge, combining raw firepower with defensive capabilities that made them nearly impossible to kill. The crews trained constantly, knowing that their first real battle could come at any moment. President Helen Carter delivered a speech to the United Nations that was broadcast across every human colony. She spoke of freedom, of humanity's right to chart its own course among the stars. For too long, they had accepted limitations imposed by species who saw them as inferiors. The artifact had given them the tools to stand as equals, and they would use those tools to secure humanity's future. The response was overwhelming support, with celebrations breaking out in cities across Earth and the colonies. The Kaveri Empire responded with fury. Ambassador Zethron called President Carter's speech an act of war and promised swift retaliation. His government assembled a battle fleet, 12 massive dreadnoughts supported by 40 smaller warships. These were vessels that had conquered dozens of species, enforced council law across hundreds of systems, and never known defeat. The fleet departed Kaveri space heading directly for Earth, making no attempt to hide their intentions. Lieutenant Kevin Ross monitored the sensor arrays aboard the Thunderbolt as the Kaveri fleet approached. The enemy ships were impressive. Sleek designs powered by antimatter reactors and armed with plasma weapons that could boil away a planet's atmosphere. They moved in perfect formation, a display of military precision developed over millennia of warfare. Against them, 6 human ships waited, outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Commander Lisa Green addressed her crew one final time before the battle. She reminded them that they were not just fighting for themselves, but for every human who had ever chafed under council restrictions. The Kaveri expected an easy victory against primitives who barely understood space travel. They would learn differently. Lisa activated the ship-wide communication system and gave the order to prepare for combat. The Kaveri admiral broadcast his final ultimatum on all frequencies. Surrender immediately and be allowed to live as subjects of the Empire, or face destruction. His voice dripped with contempt, speaking to the humans the way one might address misbehaving children. The response from the human fleet was silence, followed by all 6 Stormbreaker vessels accelerating to attack speed. The Kaveri admiral laughed, ordering his ships forward to crush this insignificant rebellion. Dr. Sophie Miller watched from Mars Command as the 2 fleets closed. Every military analyst predicted disaster for humanity. The Kaveri had superior numbers, more experience, and technology refined over thousands of years. But those analysts were working with outdated assumptions. They did not understand what the artifact had given humanity, or how effectively humans had adapted that knowledge to their own purposes. The battle began when the Thunderbolt opened fire at maximum range. The Kaveri shields, designed to deflect energy weapons and absorb plasma blasts, did nothing against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The lead dreadnought's shields flickered and died as tungsten rods punched through them, like they were made of paper. The ship's armor held for perhaps 2 seconds before catastrophic failure tore it apart from the inside out. Lieutenant Danny Foster did not have time to celebrate his first kill. His console was already tracking the next target, feeding firing solutions to the automated systems that could react faster than any organic mind. The railguns fired again and again, each shot precisely calculated to exploit weaknesses in Kaveri ship design. Missile swarms launched from the Thunderbolt's flanks, their AI guidance systems adapting to enemy countermeasures in real time. The Kaveri fleet tried to respond, but found themselves fighting an enemy that did not follow any known tactical doctrine. The human ships moved erratically, using their superior acceleration to avoid return fire. They concentrated fire on single targets, overwhelming defenses before moving to the next victim, and their weapons simply could not be stopped by conventional shields, turning every hit into a potential catastrophe. Commander Lisa Green ordered her ship into the heart of the Kaveri formation. The move was considered suicide by traditional naval tactics, but the Thunderbolt's armor held against the enemy's desperate counterattacks. At point-blank range, the human weapons were utterly devastating. 3 more Kaveri dreadnoughts died in as many minutes, their reactors overloading and destroying nearby escort vessels in secondary explosions. The battle lasted 17 minutes from first shot to final retreat. The Kaveri fleet broke formation and fled through their jump gate, abandoning damaged ships and leaving behind debris fields where proud warships had been. The human fleet had not lost a single vessel, though the Thunderbolt bore scorch marks and several armor breaches that would require repair. Lieutenant Kevin Ross could barely believe the sensor data showing what they had just accomplished. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than anyone thought possible. The Council convened emergency sessions on their capital world. The Kavari Empire mobilized every military asset they possessed, calling for allies to help crush humanity before this rebellion spread. And on hundreds of worlds, species that had lived under Council domination for generations began to whisper about what might be possible if they too chose to resist. The victory at Earth changed everything, but Admiral Victor Kane knew it was just the beginning. The Council would not accept defeat from a species they considered barely civilized. He stood in the war room at Mars Command, surrounded by holographic displays showing enemy fleet movements throughout the galaxy. 7 major empires had formed an alliance, pooling their military resources to create an armada that numbered over 300 warships. Their target was obvious, and their intention was clear. Humanity would be crushed and made an example of what happened to species who challenged the established order. Construction of new Stormbreaker vessels accelerated dramatically. Shipyards throughout the solar system worked without pause, building vessels that rolled off the assembly lines at a rate that should have been impossible. The artifact on Titan continued to provide guidance, revealing manufacturing techniques that allowed human workers and automated systems to collaborate with unprecedented efficiency. Within 6 months of the Battle of Earth, humanity fielded 37 Stormbreaker-class warships organized into 5 battle groups. Colonel Ryan Brooks commanded the defense of Proxima Centauri when the Council's allied fleet arrived. His battle group consisted of only 5 ships against an enemy force of 63 vessels from 4 different empires. The odds were worse than at Earth, but Ryan had advantages the enemy could not comprehend. His ships could coordinate their actions through quantum-linked communication systems that operated in real time across vast distances. His crews had trained for months in tactics that the galaxy considered dishonorable, uncivilized, or simply too dangerous to attempt. The enemy fleet emerged from their jump gate in standard formation, a wall of warships that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. Their admiral broadcast a demand for surrender, giving the human forces 1 hour to power down their weapons and prepare to be boarded. Ryan's response was to order his ships to scatter, each one accelerating in a different direction at maximum thrust. The enemy commanders were confused by this apparent retreat but ordered pursuit, confident that their superior numbers would allow them to run down the fleeing humans. Lieutenant Claire Morgan piloted her fighter squadron through the asteroid belt at speeds that made her navigational computer scream warnings. The Stormbreaker carriers had launched their strike craft before scattering, and now those small, agile vessels led enemy ships into prepared kill zones. Claire's fighter was barely larger than a bus, but it carried missiles powerful enough to cripple vessels 1,000 times its size. She waited until her targets were committed to their course before opening fire, her weapons streaking toward enemy ships that could not maneuver quickly enough to evade. Dr. Amy Peterson coordinated the battle from the command ship Warhammer, monitoring data feeds from every human vessel and weapon system in the Proxima system. The Stormbreaker fleet's true advantage was not any single piece of technology, but how all their systems worked together. AI programs tracked enemy movements and predicted their actions seconds before they happened. Targeting computers shared information instantaneously, ensuring that firepower was never wasted on targets already doomed, and the human commanders had complete freedom to improvise and adapt, unbound by the rigid tactical doctrines that governed Council militaries. The first enemy casualties came when a squadron of Kavari destroyers pursued what they thought was a crippled human frigate into a dense asteroid field. Colonel Ryan had positioned his ship there deliberately, using its powerful sensors to map every rock and calculate every trajectory. When the Kavari entered the field, the frigate suddenly accelerated and dove behind a massive asteroid. The pursuing destroyers tried to follow but found themselves in a maze of tumbling rocks moving at lethal velocities. The human ship emerged unscathed while wreckage marked where 5 enemy vessels had been. The Council's allied fleet began to understand they were not fighting a conventional battle. Human ships appeared and disappeared, striking from unexpected angles and vanishing before effective counterfire could be brought to bear. They used the terrain shamelessly, hiding behind planets and moons emerging from the shadow of asteroids to launch devastating attacks and then retreating before the enemy could respond. Every engagement cost the Allied fleet ships while the humans seemed untouchable. Commander Lisa Green brought the Thunderbolts screaming out of a steep gravity well, using Jupiter's immense mass to accelerate her ship to velocities that strained the structural integrity of the hull. Behind her, 8 enemy dreadnoughts attempted the same maneuver but lacked the precise navigation required. 2 clipped Jupiter's atmosphere and burned up like meteors, their shields overwhelmed by friction heat. The remaining 6 emerged in disarray, their formation broken and their commanders disoriented. The Thunderbolt was waiting for them, weapons already locked on target. Lieutenant Danny Foster fired the main railguns in a pattern that his targeting computer recommended. The tungsten rods did not aim for the enemy ships directly, but instead calculated trajectories that would create a devastating crossfire. 6 simultaneous impacts from multiple angles overwhelmed the dreadnought's defensive systems. 1 exploded immediately, its reactor containment breached. 2 more went dead in space, their power systems knocked offline. The survivors broke off and retreated at maximum thrust, abandoning their crippled companions. Dr. Amy Peterson noticed a pattern in the enemy fleet's movements. Despite coming from 4 different empires, they were trying to coordinate their actions through a central command structure. That was a weakness she could exploit. She relayed targeting priorities to all human ships, designating the enemy command vessels for priority destruction. Within an hour, 3 flagships and 2 communications relay stations had been reduced to debris. The Allied fleet's coordination collapsed into chaos as individual commanders made conflicting decisions. The battle for Proxima Centauri raged for 18 hours, spread across the entire system. Human ships engaged and disengaged at will, never allowing the enemy to bring their numerical superiority to bear. The Council's forces tried to regroup multiple times, but found themselves constantly harassed and divided. Human fighter squadrons stung like wasps, targeting vulnerable engine sections and sensor arrays. Larger vessels ambushed enemy formations from behind planetary bodies, striking hard and fast before vanishing again. Colonel Ryan Brooks watched as the enemy fleet finally broke. They had lost 97 ships, nearly 2/3 of their original force. The survivors abandoned the system in complete disorder, some fleeing through the jump gate while others used emergency FTL drives that could damage their vessels but would get them away from this nightmare. The human fleet had lost 2 Stormbreaker vessels, both damaged beyond repair, but with their crews safely evacuated. The victory at Proxima sent shockwaves through the galaxy that dwarfed the impact of Earth's defense. The Council had committed significant military resources from multiple empires, and humanity had crushed them with tactics that made traditional space warfare look obsolete. Admiral Victor Kane received reports of panic in Council space as military commanders struggled to develop countermeasures for an enemy that refused to fight by established rules. More importantly, the victory inspired resistance throughout Council-controlled space. Species that had paid tribute for generations began to question why they continued to submit to powers that could not even defeat the newcomer humans. Rebellion sparked on a dozen worlds. Trade routes disrupted as colonies refused to ship resources to their imperial overlords. The carefully maintained order that had governed the galaxy for thousands of years began to crack and crumble. President Helen Carter delivered another speech, this time addressing not just humanity, but any species that could receive the transmission. She spoke of freedom and self-determination, of the right of all peoples to choose their own destiny rather than having it imposed by ancient empires. She offered alliance to any species willing to stand against Council domination, and she made it clear that humanity would defend not just themselves, but any who sought to break free from the old order. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, 15 species formally requested human military assistance. Dozens more sent secret communications expressing support, but unable to openly resist yet. The galaxy was changing, and the Council powers found themselves facing not just a human rebellion but a cascade of revolutions that threatened to tear apart the structure they had built over millennia. Admiral Victor Kane knew this was only the beginning. The Council would not surrender power easily, and far bloodier conflicts lay ahead. But humanity had proven something vital. The old empires were not invincible, and their time as unquestioned rulers was coming to an end. The galaxy would never be the same, and the humans who had been dismissed as primitive newcomers were now the ones shaking the foundations of galactic civilization. The rebellion spread faster than anyone anticipated, and the Galactic Council found itself fighting fires on 100 different worlds. Species that had submitted peacefully for centuries now refused to pay tribute or acknowledge council authority. Supply lines collapsed as colonies withheld resources. Ancient alliances crumbled as member species questioned why they should support empires that could not even defeat humanity. The council's response was predictable: overwhelming military force to restore order and remind the galaxy who held true power. Admiral Victor Kane received intelligence reports daily about council fleet movements. They were preparing something massive, a concentration of military power larger than anything seen in recorded galactic history. Every major empire contributed ships pulling vessels from patrol routes and planetary defense fleets. The target was obvious: Earth itself. The Council intended to make humanity an example so terrifying that no other species would dare follow their path to independence. Commander Jake Morrison returned to Titan one last time before the coming storm. He stood in the chamber with the artifact, its blue light dimmer now after giving up so much of its stored knowledge. Dr. Laura Bennett had remained there, studying the device continuously for over a year. She told Jake something she had discovered recently. The artifact was not unique. The ancient civilization had left others like it scattered across the galaxy, each one waiting for species ready to break free from cycles of domination. Humanity had been first to find and activate one, but they might not be the last. The Council's armada began gathering at a staging point just outside human-controlled space. Intelligence reports counted over 800 warships, representing the combined military might of the galaxy's most powerful empires. Against this, humanity could field 93 Stormbreaker vessels and perhaps 200 support craft. The numbers looked hopeless, but Admiral Kane had no intention of fighting a conventional battle. He had learned from the victories at Earth and Proxima. Numerical superiority meant nothing if it could not be brought to bear effectively. President Helen Carter addressed the human fleet before they departed for the staging point. She spoke from the bridge of the newest Stormbreaker vessel, the Valiant, which would serve as the fleet's mobile command center. Her message was simple: they were not fighting for conquest or domination, but for the right to exist as equals in a galaxy that had always treated them as inferiors. Every human ship would carry that message into battle, and they would show the Council that humanity could not be intimidated or destroyed. Lieutenant Kevin Ross had been promoted to captain of his own Stormbreaker vessel, the Defiant. He led a battle group of 7 ships assigned to the fleet's vanguard. Their mission was to disrupt the enemy formation before the main engagement began. Kevin reviewed the tactical plans with his crew, explaining that they would be using strategies that would shock and horrify enemy commanders trained in traditional warfare. There would be no honorable ship-to-ship duels or careful positioning. They would hit hard, hit fast, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Dr. Amy Peterson had developed a new weapons system based on additional data from the artifact. The Stormbreaker drives could create temporary wormholes, and she had found a way to weaponize that capability. A ship could open a wormhole directly inside an enemy vessel, allowing a missile or kinetic projectile to bypass shields and armor completely. The power requirements were enormous, limiting each ship to only a few such attacks, but the psychological impact would be devastating. Enemy crews would realize that no amount of armor could protect them. The human fleet arrived at the staging point 2 days before the Council armada was scheduled to depart. Admiral Kane did not wait for the enemy to come to him. He ordered an immediate attack on the assembled fleet, while they were still organizing into formation. The Stormbreaker vessels emerged from their own wormholes scattered throughout the enemy staging area, each one appearing exactly where it would cause maximum confusion and damage. Commander Lisa Green brought the Thunderbolt into existence less than 100 meters from a Kavari dreadnought's bridge section. Her railguns fired before the enemy crew even understood what was happening, the tungsten rods punching through the unshielded command tower and killing everyone inside in milliseconds. The dreadnought went dead in space, its automated systems unable to function without organic oversight. Lisa ordered her ship back into a wormhole and disappeared before nearby vessels could target her. Lieutenant Danny Foster used the new wormhole weapons for the first time, opening a portal directly inside an enemy cruiser's reactor chamber. The missile that went through the portal was small, barely larger than a grenade, but it detonated in the worst possible location. The cruiser's antimatter containment failed catastrophically, and the resulting explosion took out 3 nearby ships. Danny's hands were shaking as he targeted his next victim, both horrified and amazed by the weapon's effectiveness. The Council Armada descended into chaos. Ships collided with each other as they attempted emergency maneuvers to avoid the human attackers, who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Commander screamed contradictory orders over communication channels jammed with distress calls and damage reports. The carefully planned formation that was supposed to intimidate humanity into surrender had become a death trap where friendly fire caused as much damage as human weapons. Captain Kevin Ross led his battle group in a coordinated strike on the enemy supply vessels. These ships carried fuel, ammunition, and spare parts essential for the Armada's planned assault on Earth. The Defiant and her companions emerged from wormholes already firing, targeting the vulnerable transports that had minimal armor and few weapons. Within minutes, the Council's logistical support was burning debris, and their ability to sustain a prolonged campaign had been crippled. Dr. Sophie Miller watched from the Valiant as the battle unfolded, according to the tactical plan she had helped develop. The human fleet was outnumbered nearly 9-1, but those numbers meant nothing when the enemy could not coordinate their actions or bring their weapons to bear. Human ships controlled the tempo of battle, choosing when and where to engage, while the Council forces reacted desperately to threats that appeared without warning and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. The Kavari Admiral attempted to regain control by ordering all ships to activate their defensive shields to maximum and form defensive clusters. This was sound tactical thinking against conventional weapons, but it made the ships easy targets for the wormhole weapons. Dr. Amy Peterson designated priority targets and watched as missiles appeared inside shield perimeters, bypassing the only defense the enemy had. 27 ships died in the first coordinated wormhole strike, their reactors breached or their command sections destroyed from within. Commander Jake Morrison led a strike force against the enemy's long-range sensor arrays. These massive stations allowed the Council to track fleet movements across dozens of light years and coordinate reinforcements. Jake's ships emerged from wormholes at point-blank range and unleashed every weapon they carried. The sensor arrays, built for detection rather than combat, crumbled under the assault. The Council fleet lost its eyes, unable to call for help or even know where all their own ships were positioned. The battle lasted 6 hours before the Council Admiral ordered a general retreat. The Armada that was supposed to crush humanity had been shattered, with over 400 ships destroyed or too damaged to jump to safety. The survivors fled in all directions, abandoning their wounded and their dead in their panic to escape. The human fleet regrouped, having lost 11 vessels but achieved a victory that seemed impossible just hours earlier. Admiral Victor Kane did not celebrate. He knew this battle was not the end, but merely another step in a longer war. The Council would rebuild, would learn from this defeat and adapt their tactics. But something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. Humanity had proven repeatedly that they could not be intimidated or destroyed by conventional military power. Every species watching these battles learned the same lesson. The old order could be challenged and defeated. President Helen Carter received reports from across the galaxy. 28 species had declared independence from the Council in the wake of humanity's latest victory. Dozens more were in open revolt, their populations refusing to acknowledge Council authority. The carefully maintained structure of galactic governance was collapsing, unable to withstand the force of so many peoples demanding freedom simultaneously. Lieutenant Claire Morgan returned to Earth after the battle, her fighter damaged but flyable. She walked through the streets of the city where she had grown up, seeing crowds celebrating humanity's victories. Children played with toy spaceships, reenacting battles they had heard about. Old people who remembered when humanity first reached the stars wept with joy at seeing their species stand as equals with the galaxy's ancient powers. The future looked uncertain, but for the first time in human history it was a future they would write themselves. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session on their capital world. The chamber that had witnessed 10,000 years of unquestioned authority now hosted desperate debates about survival. Some advocated for negotiation with The human fleet gathered at the edge of Council space. 117 Stormbreaker vessels organized into the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. Admiral Victor Kane stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking at the holographic display showing the route to the Council's capital world. This would not be an invasion but a demonstration, a show of force to convince the old empires that continued resistance was pointless. President Helen Carter had given him clear instructions. Minimize casualties, but make humanity's strength absolutely clear to anyone watching. Commander Jake Morrison led the advance group through the first jump point into Council territory. His sensors detected defensive stations and patrol fleets, but the Council forces did not engage. They watched the human ships pass, their commanders uncertain whether to fight or flee. Jake understood their hesitation. Every species in the galaxy had heard about humanity's victories, had seen recordings of Council armadas destroyed by forces a fraction of their size. The psychological impact was perhaps more valuable than any weapon the artifact had provided. Dr. Laura Bennett remained on Earth, coordinating with scientists from newly independent species who were reaching out to humanity for assistance. 17 different civilizations had requested help understanding their own ancient artifacts, similar to the one found on Titan. The ancient builders had apparently scattered these gifts across the entire galaxy, each one calibrated to activate for species that demonstrated certain characteristics. Laura wondered what those builders would think if they could see how their legacy was reshaping galactic civilization. The Council's capital world of Zenthar Prime was a monument to imperial power, a planet-wide city that housed the bureaucracy governing thousands of worlds. The Council chambers themselves were built from materials gathered from 100 conquered planets, each stone representing another species brought under their control. For 10,000 years, this world had been the center of galactic authority, and its inhabitants had never imagined that authority could be challenged. That assumption was about to be tested. President Helen Carter traveled with the fleet aboard the newest Stormbreaker vessel, christened the Unity. She would personally deliver humanity's demands to the Council, but she would do so from a position of overwhelming strength. The Unity dropped out of wormhole space just outside Zenthar Prime's orbital defense grid, followed by the rest of the human fleet. They maintained formation, weapons powered but not armed, a clear message that humanity sought peace but was prepared for war. The Council's defensive fleet numbered over 200 ships, gathered hastily from across their territory. They formed a wall between the human vessels and the capital world, but there was no conviction in their positioning. The commanders knew what humanity's ships could do, knew that shields and armor meant little against weapons that could appear inside your own vessel or strike from impossible angles. Admiral Victor Kane broadcast a simple message. Humanity sought an audience with the Council to negotiate terms of peace. The defensive fleet parted, allowing the human ships passage. Commander Lisa Green maintained tactical oversight of the fleet while President Carter prepared for the Council meeting. Her sensors detected weapons systems tracking human ships from orbital platforms and ground-based installations. One word from her president and she could destroy those threats in seconds, but Lisa hoped it would not come to that. Enough blood had been spilled already. The goal now was to build something better than the old order, not simply replace one empire with another. Lieutenant Danny Foster stood watch at his weapons station, fingers hovering over controls that could unleash devastating force. He had fired those weapons in battle 4 times now, had watched enemy ships break apart under his attacks. The kills haunted his dreams, but he did not regret them.
Every battle had been against forces that sought to enslave or destroy humanity.
Now perhaps there could be a different path forward, one where the weapons stayed silent and words replaced violence. President Helen Carter entered the Council chambers flanked by Admiral Kane and Commander Jake Morrison. The vast circular room was filled with representatives from dozens of species, many of them visibly hostile. The Kavari ambassador glared at her with undisguised hatred. The Zenthari representative clutched his ceremonial staff so hard his knuckles turned white. But others looked at her with something like hope, representatives from species tired of paying tribute and following rules written by their conquerors. The Council Prime Speaker, an ancient being from a species that had dominated galactic politics for 3,000 years, addressed President Carter formally. He acknowledged humanity's military victories and their disruption of the established order. He offered concessions. Humanity would be granted full Council membership, their territory expanded, and their trade restrictions lifted. In exchange, humanity would share the artifact's technology and help restore stability to the galaxy under Council guidance. President Carter listened politely and then rejected the offer completely. Humanity did not seek membership in the Council or permission to exist as equals. They sought the dissolution of the Council itself, an end to the tribute system, and the recognition of all species' right to self-determination. The chamber erupted in protest, representatives shouting over each other. The Prime Speaker called for order, his voice strained with barely controlled fury. Admiral Victor Kane stepped forward and activated a holographic display showing military strength comparisons. Humanity now fielded more advanced warships than any 3 Council empires combined. Allied species contributed hundreds of additional vessels. The Council's military superiority, maintained for millennia, had evaporated in less than 2 years. They could choose to accept the new reality peacefully, or they could fight and lose everything. The choice was theirs. The Kavari ambassador demanded humanity be tried for war crimes, citing their dishonorable tactics and failure to respect the conventions of civilized warfare. Commander Jake Morrison responded by listing Council atrocities committed against species unable to resist, entire civilizations wiped out for refusing to submit. The Council chambers fell silent as he detailed crimes that everyone knew about, but had agreed never to discuss. The Old Order's authority rested on convenient amnesia about how that authority had been established. Dr. Amy Peterson broadcast from the Unity, explaining to the assembled Council representatives how the artifact's technology worked and why it could not simply be taken and copied. The ancient builders had designed their gifts to activate only for species demonstrating specific traits: innovation, adaptability, and a willingness to challenge unjust authority. The Council empires, comfortable in their power, would never trigger an artifact's activation. Only species struggling against domination could access that knowledge. President Carter presented her terms clearly. The Council would be restructured as a voluntary association of equal members, with no species holding authority over others. The tribute system would end immediately, with colonies granted independence or the choice to remain part of their parent civilizations on negotiated terms. Jump gate access would be open to all species, ending the monopoly that had allowed the Council to control galactic commerce. And any species seeking independence would receive humanity's protection during their transition. The Council representatives debated for 7 hours, some accepting the inevitable, while others raged against the death of an order that had enriched and empowered them for so long. The Prime Speaker finally called for a vote, knowing that rejection meant war with an enemy they could not defeat. The resolution passed by a narrow margin, more from pragmatism than principle. The old Galactic Council would dissolve within 1 standard year, replaced by a voluntary confederation of independent species. Lieutenant Claire Morgan watched the news broadcasts from Earth, seeing crowds celebrating across the planet. Humanity had gone from restricted newcomers to architects of a new galactic order in less than 2 years. Her grandmother, who had lived through the early days of human space exploration, called her crying with joy. They had lived long enough to see humanity stand as equals with species millions of years old. Commander Lisa Green oversaw the fleet's withdrawal from Zenthar Prime. The Council's defensive forces maintained their distance, making no aggressive moves. Some even transmitted congratulations or requests for future cooperation. The galaxy was changing, and those who adapted quickly would thrive in the new order. Those who clung to the old ways would find themselves increasingly isolated and irrelevant. Admiral Victor Kane returned to Mars Command and began the work of building a different kind of military force. Humanity's Stormbreaker fleet would remain strong, but its purpose would shift from conquest to protection. They would defend not just human territory, but any species threatened by those who sought to restore the old order by force. The fleet would be humanity's contribution to galactic stability, proof that power could be used to liberate rather than dominate. Dr. Laura Bennett made a final trip to Titan, to the chamber where the artifact still pulsed with its faint blue light. She had finally translated the last inscription, words that had taken 2 years to fully understand. The message was simple but profound. Cycles of domination ensure,